Good morning. Welcome to our study this morning. We're continuing our series on conscience, morality, and the spiritual life. Today we will cover lessons 17 and 18. The title of today's lessons are Morality, Regeneration, and Thinking. There are three topics that we're going to touch on today in my quest to keep you focused on the primary areas of our study: the morality study, the morality study, the conscience study, and the spiritual life study. I am hitting different aspects of the doctrine one time and going through, kind of cycling through all of the aspects, and then coming back and hitting more and introducing new aspects, and we'll do that today. We'll hit morality again today. We'll review regeneration from an old study from Spiritual Life Basics, and we'll begin to cover the thinking process. We'll just introduce it today and go into it in great detail next week so that we can begin to see where all of this is going. We'll begin our study in our typical fashion of allowing you a few moments of silent prayer. So if you need to utilize 1 John 1:9 and to confess any known sins so that you might be cleansed of those sins and cleansed of all unrighteousness, we'll take that opportunity now. So please pray with me. Father, as we study this hour, we ask for the Spirit's mentorship in our spiritual study, that you will, through the Spirit, make these things real to us, that they will bring up the memory of past doctrines so that we might recycle them and to bring them up towards the surface of our thinking processes so that we might appraise what we study in light of your word, so that we therefore can come to a better understanding of where we are going as we continue on in this study. We thank you for our opportunity to be together, meet together in freedom and peace. We pray for our brothers and sisters throughout the world who do not have that opportunity. We pray for their momentum in their spiritual lives because of the situations they face, the situations of danger and persecution because of their faith in you and your Son. We ask that they, by their testimony, be a witness for him and your love. And we thank you for it all in his name. Amen. Conscience, morality, and the spiritual life, lessons 17 and 18, morality, regeneration, and thinking. And we have a lot to cover this week. I was gone last week, so I thought we'd probably just go ahead and do 4 hours today to make up for it. And amen. Today we begin our quest to understand the 5 moral foundations and to be able to identify them in our thinking process and to ultimately recognize the contradiction of moral living and the spiritual life. We will begin with a study of the development of the 5 moral foundations, how they came to be identified, and the cultural context in which their study has been undertaken. Then we'll look at a short review of regeneration, the source of our spiritual life. Finally, we will introduce the thinking process, which we will develop in greater detail next week. First, Jonathan Haidt's brief description of the 5 moral foundations. Remember, Jonathan Haidt is an atheistic Jew, or a Jewish atheist, I guess, say it that way. He is quite open-minded. That's one of the things I like about him. But you'll see from his description here that he is certainly a materialist, an evolutionist, and I have edited out some of it just to make it a little bit shorter for this introductory slide, the next 2 slides. First we have, of the 5 moral foundations, harm/care. It's related to our ability to feel and to dislike the pain of others. This foundation underlies virtues of kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. The second of the 5 is fairness/reciprocity. Related to reciprocal altruism, this foundation generates ideas of justice, rights, and autonomy. The third of the five universal moral foundations that have been found to date in the study of cultures throughout the world, we found these. They have found these five basic foundations. I have a feeling there's going to be a sixth that we'll discover as we go along the way here, but so far only five have been identified by the philosophical psychology people. And so we'll go with their five for now until we find the sixth as we study through this all. Number 3, in-group loyalty, related to virtues of patriotism and self-sacrifice for the group. It is active anytime people feel that it's one for all and all for one. The fourth is authority respect. This foundation underlies virtues of leadership and followership, including deference to legitimate authority and respect for traditions. The fifth is purity sanctity, shaped by the psychology of disgust and contamination. This foundation underlies religious notions of striving to live in an elevated, less carnal, more noble way. It underlies the widespread idea that the body is a temple which can be desecrated by immoral activities and contaminants, an idea not unique to religious traditions. So those are the five in brief, and we're going to cover them in a little more detail later on. But I thought I would give you a bit of the background on how all of this has developed in psychology so that you can see just where the world is, the cosmic system is in understanding morality, and why, as it grows in that direction, we as Christians will be compartmentalized into the non-moral people. How we will become the bad guys as the secular notions of morality continue to expand in their ways. You have noticed in your conversations with unbelievers, especially of the liberal persuasion, that they cannot understand at all how you believe the way you believe. It's just totally foreign to their way of thinking. And of course, we find their way of thinking to be totally foreign to us. And it boils down to a great extent from these five moral foundations that we share, compared to the two of the five that they think are really, truly the morals. And we'll see that as we look at this. This is taken from an article by Haidt called When Morality Opposes Justice. Lawrence Kohlberg founded the modern field of moral psychology. That was in 1969. Notice it was in the late 60s. Notice late 60s. He did so by proposing a grand theory that unified moral psychology as the study of the progressive development of the individual's understanding of justice. Okay? The grand theory that the unified moral psychology that he proposed, that it was the unified moral psychology, was the progressive development of an individual's understanding of justice. Building on the work of Piaget, Kohlberg proposed that moral development in all cultures is driven forward by the process of role-taking. As children get more practice at taking each other's perspectives, they learn to transcend their own position and appreciate when and why an action, practice, or custom is fair or unfair. Children learn that growing up. That was Kohlberg's theory here, is that they learn that as they develop by playing with each other. Children may be blinded by their need for approval. This is Kohlberg's stage 3. He felt that as they developed, they would get to the point that they would see justice, fairness, and unfairness. Well, they had a stage along the way where they wanted approval from others, and he called that stage 3. And then the next stage, or by the overbearing pronouncements of authority figures, he called that stage 4, that they were corrupted by these earlier stages, that these earlier stages were developmental stages in the process of getting to truly understanding justice and fairness. So here we see approbation is one of them and the authority is another. But if given enough practice and exposure to democratic institutions, they will, in adolescence, reach the post-conventional level of moral reasoning, which is stage 5, the ultimate for Kohlberg. Here, the post-conventional level of moral reasoning at which actions and cultural practices can be critiqued based on the degree to which they instantiate justice. So when you can determine justice, you have arrived at morality according to Kohlberg. Okay? When you can critique things and see, well, this is fair, this is not fair. Okay? That's morality for Kohlberg. Kohlberg's theory was famously criticized by Carol Gilligan in 1982, who proposed an alternative foundation for ethics, care. Gilligan thought that women, more than men, based their moral judgments and actions on concerns about their obligations to care for, protect, and nurture those to whom they are connected, particularly those who are vulnerable. Kohlberg and most other moral psychologists ultimately conceded that justice and care were two separable foundations of morality. So eventually Kohlberg and his followers, who thought it was only justice was morality. Justice was the only thing that mattered in morality. Everything else was not morality, but some social convention of some sort. Then he ultimately, along with his followers, conceded that justice and care were both part of morality. So now we have 2 legs of the 5 foundations here in the early stages of the development of the moral psychology pursuit. Despite disagreements about which foundation was more important, and they argued about that, or whether one could be derived from the other, is harm an outgrowth of justice, or is justice an outgrowth of the harm care foundation? Nearly everyone in moral psychology was united behind a central axiom: morality is about protecting individuals. Justice and care both mattered only insofar as they protected individuals. Practices that do not protect or help individuals were seen as mere social conventions at best and as moral affronts at worst. That's you. That's me. Okay? Turiel, a student of Kohlberg, codified this individual-centered view of morality when he defined the moral domain as this: prescriptive judgments of justice, rights, and welfare pertaining to how people ought to relate to each other. Moral prescriptions are not relative to the social context, nor are they defined by it. There's a higher standard than the moral, than the social context, according to Turiel here. Correspondingly, children's moral judgments are not derived directly from social institutional systems, but from features inherent to social relationships, including experiences involving harm to persons, violations of rights, and conflicts of competing claims. When the moral domain is limited by definition to 2 foundations, the harm, welfare, care domain, and the justice, rights, fairness domain, then social justice is clearly the extension of morality out to the societal level. The programs and laws that social justice activists endorse aim to maximize the welfare and rights of individuals, particularly those whom the activists believe do not receive equal treatment or full justice in their society. So what do you have here? The rights movements. Everybody has to have their rights. And it's civil rights. It's the right of a woman to rule over her own body and anything inside. The rights of gays to do what they want to do, the rights of anyone to do what they want to do. That's That's social justice, see? It's the welfare and rights of individuals, especially those that do not receive equal treatment. So to you or I, that may not be an issue because we have no interest, let's say, in abortion. We have no interest in abortion. We're past childbearing age, or we are not married. We don't care to have children, whatever it is. That's of no interest to us, not really in our purview here of what is important to us. Well, if you were of the social justice ilk, one who was concerned about the rights, welfares, and injustices to individuals, that would suddenly become important to you, even though you may not know anybody, you may not be involved personally, but because there is an injustice, and you have what? You have crusader arrogance. You want to go out and to fight for those people's rights. See? So this is how all of this developed, is because of this context here, and how people studied it, what they studied, who they studied, said, well, that's morality. Morality is the welfare and rights and justice to people in the society, especially those who are not treated fairly in the society, the underdogs. If social justice is just morality writ large, it follows that opposition to these programs must be based on concerns other than moral concerns. So if you're against any of those social justice programs, then it's not based, you cannot be basing it on morality. You have to be basing it on something else, and that something else is your selfish self-interest. It has to be your selfish self-interest is where they have gone with that. So let's go ahead and see some more about it. Social justice research is therefore in part the search for the non-moral motivations, such as selfishness, existential fear, or blind prejudice of those who oppose social justice, primarily political conservatives. For example, one of the leading approaches to the study of political attitudes states that political conservatism is a form of motivated social cognition. People embrace conservatism in part, quote, because it serves to reduce fear, anxiety, and uncertainty, to avoid change, disruption, and ambiguity, and to explain order and justify inequality among groups and individuals. So that's why you're a conservative, because you need something to reduce your fear and your anxiety and your uncertainty, and you can't stand change because you're not mentally equipped to handle those things. So that's why you cling to your conservative beliefs, is the reason given here in the social justice vein of morality consists of harm, welfare, care, or justice, fairness, rights. Okay, those are the only two areas that are moral domains. This view of conservatives is so widespread among justice researchers that it sometimes leads to open expressions of self-righteousness and contempt. Have you seen that, any? At a recent conference on justice research, for example, a well-known researcher began her talk by stating categorically that affirmative action was the morally and practically correct policy. She then asked why many people oppose it. She dismissed the reasons conservatives sometimes give as mere theta waves, and then enumerated the self-serving mechanisms that gave rise to their delusions. Self-serving mechanisms giving rise to their delusions. See? For this speaker, affirmative action embodies justice and care, end of story. In her moral worldview, that's all there is. It is interesting to note that the leading theories in moral psychology were shaped by the social and moral tumult of the 60s and 70s, and that most of the leading figures were embedded in two of the most politically liberal communities in the United States, Cambridge, Mass., and Berkeley, California. Those who have studied morality from a more anthropological or historical perspective, however, have generally found a much broader morality which cannot be supported by only two foundations. So everything that you're seeing out there now, everything that you're seeing in the current cosmic system is governed morally by these two foundations. That's it. That's it. In fact, in one of my debates on the internet, with a highly liberal individual. who actually graduated from Berkeley in the 60s and was there in the free speech movement and involved in that. And he said, when looking at Haidt's work, what he picked out of Haidt's work was that you haven't developed enough yet. You conservatives haven't developed enough yet, and you still have these childish ideas. Remember the child stage 3 of Kohlberg wanting to fit in, and the stage 4, the moral, listening to authority figures and their pronouncement. You haven't developed beyond that yet, is what he took. Rather than what I took, looking at it from a conservative viewpoint, that liberals only operate in 2 moral domains, where conservatives operate in 5 almost equal domains. They're all very, very close together. And someday maybe we'll do our moral foundations test, and you can see where you fit. But the conservatives are high in all 5. All 5 moral foundations are important to us, but the liberals, only 2 of the 5 are important. And so I took that to mean we're much more well-rounded. Conservatives are more well-rounded. They have a better grasp of morals. But he took it that we weren't developed enough yet, that we hadn't reached moral maturity yet, was his viewpoint. Okay, so we understand that 60s and 70s, Berkeley and Cambridge thinking is what has shaped our current milieu. Look at what you hear all the time about who is in office now, and who all of the czars are, and all of the advisors. What are people, well, of course, if you listen to any conservative talk radio or TV shows, you see that there are typically, they say, the 60s radicals have taken over. The 60s radicals have taken over. So if that's true, then this is the moral foundation for them. This is the moral foundation for them. So when you see someone like Mr. Jennings, who is the Safe Schools Czar, who has actively promoted homosexuality between adults and children, and actively promoted preschool homosexual training to teach them how to be homosexuals at a young age, you see, we say, how can that be? How can anyone consider that to be moral at all? But when you see that his perspective is harm, care, welfare, justice, fairness, rights, then his rights as a homosexual to promote his viewpoint is legitimate, and overrides your social conventions that you cling to out of fear and anxiety. See? So that's why the difference in the thinking process between liberals and conservatives, and Christians, of course, who biblically based Christians are conservative, and so obviously that's why Christians are the enemy of current moral thought, because we're outdated, and we're restrictive, and we're closed-minded, and we cling to traditions that have no basis. And so let's go on and let's see what else we see. Take, for example, the Old Testament, the Quran, Confucius, or almost any ethnography of a non-Western society. Issues of loyalty to the group, respect for one's elders, self-restraint, and the regulation of bodily processes, that is, rules about food, sex, and menstruation, are highly elaborated in most human societies. Are these concerns just manifestations of an immature conventional morality, Kohlberg stages 3 and 4, as I mentioned earlier? Are they mere social conventions a la Turiel to be distinguished from the real individual-centered morality of harm, welfare, care, and justice, rights, fairness? Richard Schwader has long argued that the individual-centered moralities of Kohlberg and Turiel reflect just one of 3 widespread moral ethics. each based on a different ontological means relating to the essence or the nature of being, an ontological presupposition, a different ontological presupposition according to Schroeder. So let's see what he says. In the ethic of autonomy, Schroeder says there are three: the ethic of autonomy, the ethic of community, and the ethic of divinity. So he says, in the ethic of autonomy, the moral world is assumed to be made up exclusively of individual human beings. And the purpose of moral regulation is to protect the zone of discretionary choice of individuals and to promote the exercise of individual will in pursuit of personal preferences. That's it. That's the ethic of autonomy. That's what everyone is all about. To protect the zone of discretionary choice and to promote the exercise of individual will in pursuit of personal preferences. If it feels good, do it. And you have the right to, okay, according to ethics of autonomy. Rights, justice, fairness, and freedom are moral goods because they help to maximize the autonomy of individuals and to protect individuals from harms perpetrated by authorities or by other individuals. The ethic of community, the second of Schroeder's constructs here, is, in contrast, has a different ontological foundation. It sees the world not as a collection of individuals, but as a collection of institutions, families, tribes, guilds, or other groups. The purpose of moral regulation is to protect the moral integrity of the various stations or roles that constitute a society or a community, where a society or community is conceived of as a corporate entity with an identity, standing, history, and reputation of its own. Okay? So that's Schroeder's ethics of community. Then we have, the key virtues in this ethic are duty, respect, loyalty, and interdependence. Finally, in the ethic of divinity, it is based on the ontological presupposition that God or gods exist, and that the moral world is composed of souls housed in bodies. And here's one that we are going to look at later. He says, see Bloom 2004 for evidence that this presupposition is the natural default assumption of our species. That's the natural default assumption of our species, is that we are souls living in a body and therefore have a relationship with God. That's the default. Not harm care, not justice fairness, not the ethic of autonomy, the ethic of community, but the ethic of divinity is the default belief of everyone in the world. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? That everybody knows that there's a God deep down inside of them and that they have a moral responsibility to that God. Each soul is a bit of God, or at least a gift from God, and so the purpose of moral regulation is to protect the soul, the spirit, the spiritual aspects of the human agent and nature from degradation. If the body is a temple housing divinity within, then people should not be free to use their bodies in any way they please. Rather, moral regulation should help people to control themselves and avoid sin and spiritual pollution in matters related to sexuality, food, and religious law more generally. I thought that was very interesting that it is the default position of the species. From Schroeder's perspective, it is clear that social justice is the ethic of autonomy writ large, but the two other ethics, community and divinity, are at work in most cultures and in many Western subcultures. Political conservatism is often defined by its strong valuation of institutions and its concern that ideologies of liberation often destroy the very structures that make society and well-being possible. I'll just throw this in now. We'll probably get to it someday if I decide it's important enough to bring up. But we see a tremendous shift right now in what conservatives really believe and what conservatives are really saying at present, and this description of conservatives and what's important. And I don't think I got enough of it from the article to really bring that out, so we'll bring it out later. But I want you to be aware that how they categorize conservatives is not what's happening right now. Not what's happening now. I'll give you just a brief example, if that's possible. The authority institution. Are conservatives currently pro-authority government institution? No. And that's something that you'll find in these 5 moral foundations, is that one can be overridden by others. One can be overridden by concerns in the others. So if let's say that moral foundation authority is overridden by, well, let's just pick as a conservative issue, the purity sanctity foundation that we haven't gotten to yet. But the purity sanctity is more important than the authority one, then we're going to be anti-authority if authority is anti-purity sanctity. So you'll see that interplay there. Okay. Most conservatives, with the exception of some economic conservatives, therefore embrace the ethic of community and are morally opposed to the extreme individual freedom promoted by a pure ethic of autonomy and by most social justice activists. Conservative groups that are religious, such as the American Religious Right, share this embrace of institutions and traditions embodied in the ethic of community, and then add in a passionate concern for the ethic of divinity. They see secular humanism as an organized effort to encourage people to live in an ungodly way, each person choosing his own goals and values based on what feels good or right to her alone. We would say him alone, but because you have to be politically correct, you'd say her alone, right? Okay. So when the electorate fails to embrace liberal policies and candidates, when a nation fails to rally around social justice concerns, it is at least plausible that there are moral motivations at work, motivations that liberals may not recognize as moral at all. For example, the Bush, who did he run against last? I forget that person's name. John Kerry, yeah, that's who it was. Was it John Kerry? Yeah, John Kerry. He ran, didn't he? Well, when people left the voting booths and they did the exit polls, and they said, we voted for Bush. And they said, well, why did you do that? And they said, well, because of my moral position. And the liberals are going, what? How in the world can you vote on a moral basis for a man who is killing people in a foreign land, who has denied rights to people, who has set up this what do they call that? The Patriot Act. How could you morally vote for that person? He's the most immoral person you've ever seen. He should be tried as a war criminal. He should be impeached for his immorality. But for the conservative, he was standing up for morals. For the liberal, he was anti-moral. So you see the conflict that is there between liberals and conservatives. Okay. If conservative morality goes far beyond justice, then it may often happen that moral emotions and intuitions that are not related to justice can oppose moral emotions and intuitions that are. Cultures vary in the degree in which they construct value and teach virtues based on the 5 intuitive foundations. The 5 intuitive foundations: harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, and purity, and you can add sanctity there. Purity/sanctity. All right, so let's look at a little more detail at what harm, care is, and all of the 5 for that matter. This is from, remember, the evolutionary perspective. And I'm leaving it just the way it is. When we get to studying it in our biblical construct of morality versus spirituality, then I'll leave out all of the evolutionary stuff and just name it by what its results are. But I think it's interesting that we see what the thinking processes are involved in determining how these 5 moral foundations began. I think, and I haven't developed this yet, but I think that we'll find the 5 in the book of Genesis. And we'll find them there immediately upon the creation of mankind. So let's look. The long history of mammalian evolution has shaped maternal brains to be sensitive to signs of suffering in one's own offspring. That makes sense. That sounds reasonable. That would happen. In many primate species, particularly humans, this sensitivity has extended beyond the mother-child relationship, so that all normally developed individuals dislike seeing suffering in others and have the potential to feel the emotion of compassion in response. Compassion, however, is not inevitable. It can be turned off by many forces, including one of the 4 systems described below, one of the other 4 moral foundations. Because people have a sensitivity to cruelty and harm, analogous to the negative sensations caused by taste buds for bitterness. You see, this is genetic. It's just as you have a taste bud for bitterness, you have a genetic predisposition against harm and for care and welfare of others. They feel approval toward those who prevent or relieve harm. And this approval is culturally codified in virtues such as kindness and compassion, and also in corresponding vices such as cruelty and aggression. Cultures vary in how much they value and emphasize these virtues and vices relative to others described below. Number 2, fairness, reciprocity. The long history of alliance formation and cooperation among unrelated individuals, non-family individuals, in many primate species has led to the evolution of a suite of emotions that motivate reciprocal altruism, including anger, guilt, and gratitude. Because people feel these emotions when they observe or engage in reciprocal interactions, all cultures have developed virtues related to fairness and justice. And conservatives score very high in fairness and justice. I mean, conservatives are just like liberals in that regard. Harm, care, fairness, justice, everybody scores high, and that doesn't matter who you are. You'll never argue over that as a basis of morality. What is harm, what is care, what is fair, what is justice is what we'll argue about. Okay? These virtues can, of course, be overridden by moral concerns from the other 4 systems and by the many self-serving biases that lead to errors of social perception. In some, but not all cultures, participation in reciprocal interactions and role-taking, plus many other historical and economic factors, have led to the elaboration and valuation of individual rights and equality in much the way that Kohlberg said. Most traditional cultures, however, do not have highly developed notions of individual rights, nor do most cultures appear to value or seek to create equality among all adult members or even among all adult male members. And he has here a reference to Beam on how rare egalitarian societies are and how hard people in such societies must work to suppress their natural proclivities towards hierarchy. Fairness is an excellent candidate for a universal, though variably applied, value, but equality of outcome or status is not. Third, in-group loyalty. The long history of living in kin-based groups of a few dozen individuals, for humans as well as for other primate species, has led to special social cognitive abilities backed up by strong social emotions related to recognizing, trusting, and cooperating with members of one's co-residing in-group while being wary and distrustful of members of other groups. Okay, well, we have that. And now as the question is, of course, from our perspective, is that an evolutionary thing or is that something that we are all born with for protection? To be confident in our group and wary of another group. Is that a way that God has designed us so that we will maintain our safety? I mean, if you take a small child, has no concept. So the small child sees a street gang beating someone up, they'll walk right on in. They have no concept of that, that's a bad thing, that group is a bad group. But as they get older and they learn, wait a minute, you got to stay away from some kind of groups. Some groups are dangerous to you. So that's certainly a true moral foundation that we have. The activities that come out of that, of course, are different. Because people value their in-groups, they also value those who sacrifice for the in-group, and they despise those who betray or fail to come to the aid of the in-group, particularly in times of conflict. Most cultures, therefore, have constructed virtues such as loyalty, patriotism, and heroism, usually a masculine virtue expressed in defense of the group. From this point of view, it is hard to see why diversity should be celebrated and increased, while rituals that strengthen group solidarity, such as a pledge of allegiance to the national flag, should be challenged in court. I mean, if you're an in-group person, then how could anybody burn the flag? How could anybody challenge the Pledge of Allegiance? How can anybody refuse to pledge allegiance? Well, if the in-group isn't your in-group, then it's easy to do. It's easy to do. According to in-group-based moralities, dissent is not patriotic, as some American bumper stickers suggest. Rather, criticizing one's in-group while it is engaged in an armed conflict with another group is betrayal or even treason. And we've seen that, of course, that people who were dissenting against the Vietnam War were traitors. Okay? They were betraying the country. Same thing true currently with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, though you don't see very many people protesting against those anymore, do you? And that's why. Because the protesters in-group is in power, and so they suddenly switch from not being real in-group oriented. Their in-group scoring now on the tests would go way up because their in-group is in power. Okay. Fourth, authority respect. The long history of living in hierarchically structured in-groups, where dominant males and females get certain prerequisites but are also expected to provide certain protections or services, has shaped human and chimpanzee, and to a lesser extent bonobo, brains to help them flexibly navigate in hierarchical communities. See, it's a brain thing. It's materialism. It's evolution. Dominance in other primate species relies heavily on physical force and fear. But in human communities, the picture is more nuanced, relying largely on prestige and voluntary deference. People often feel respect, awe, and admiration toward legitimate authorities, and many cultures have constructed virtues related to good leadership, which is often thought to invoke magnanimity, fatherliness, and wisdom. Bad leaders are despotic, exploitative, or inept. Yeah. Conversely, many societies value virtues related to subordination, respect, duty, and obedience. From this point of view, bumper stickers that urge people to question authority and protests that involve civil disobedience are not heroic, they are antisocial. The fifth, purity, sanctity. Against the long background of primate evolution, the human transition to a heavily meat-based diet occurred recently, 1 to 3 million years ago. The move to meat, which may have included scavenging carcasses, coincided with the rapid growth of the human frontal cortex. And these two changes, meat eating and cortical growth, appear to have given humans, and only humans, the emotion of disgust. Okay. So, if you ever wondered why vegetarians are a little slow, because they didn't eat enough meat to develop their frontal cortex, I guess. The concept here is that this evolved because of eating meat, and your frontal cortex developed so that you would have disgust, because if that carcass was fresh roadkill, you could serve it at the restaurant. But if it's old roadkill and it stinks or it tastes funny, then disgust says, I'm not eating that. But there are people today in Kentucky, right here where we live, that they see roadkill, and we got supper tonight. Okay? Well, we're going to have burgoo tonight. Okay? That's normal to them. Okay? And many cultures throughout the world, that would be just fine. It's a dead animal. Let's eat. Now, this aspect of disgust that he's talking about here is when it starts to stink. Right? Or in our area, flies. Flies land on those dead, stinking, rotting carcasses. So flies are disgusting to us, right? So that disgust is evolutionarily explained as the protection of you from killing yourself by eating bad stuff. Okay? And then religions developed it on to the point that that had something to do with the way you behaved. Okay? Disgust appears to function as a guardian of the body in all cultures, responding to elicitors that are biologically or culturally linked to disease transmission, such things as feces, vomit, rotting corpses, and animals whose habits associate them with such vectors. However, in most human societies, I find it very interesting that people still love to have dogs kiss them, even though dogs are one of those animals that are whose habits associate them with such vectors. And but yet, because we have this other thing about dogs, well, the dog kissing you is quite okay for some people. Some people are highly developed in the area of disgust and don't want anything to do with that. All right. However, in most human societies, disgust has become a social emotion as well, attached at a minimum to those whose appearance, those with a deformity, obesity, or a disease state, or occupation, the lowest castes in caste-based societies, are usually involved in disposing of excrement or corpses. Makes people feel queasy. Okay? So when you see someone, it kind of gives you that reaction of disgust. And if you analyzed it, there's really nothing disgusting about it. But for some reason, it hits us that way. And I think it's what's that? What? The built-in, I'm talking about the appearance of some people. You know, this appearance of some people. Deformity, obesity, or disease state. Okay? Now, there are people that won't go near someone who's sick because of the fact that they're sick and they might catch something. Not on the basis of, I rationalize that this person might be contagious. Let's say they're absolutely not contagious. Let's say that they have cancer and they're emaciated and they have physical deformities related to the cancer. Well, there are people who would not associate with those people out of disgust. So disgust has a range and it has a functionality in some instances, of course, but in other instances it's not. And that's what they're talking about here, is that sometimes there's no rational basis for it. It's just a reaction. In many cultures, disgust goes beyond such contaminant-related issues and supports a set of virtues and vices linked to bodily activities in general and religious activities in particular. Those who seem ruled by carnal passions, lust, gluttony, greed, and anger are seen as debased, impure, and less than human, while those who live so that the soul is in charge of the body, by being chaste, spiritually minded, or pious, are seen as elevated and sanctified. From this point of view, a philosophy that says, if it feels good, do it, is the philosophy of the devil. We will look at these moral foundations in greater detail later. We'll actually look at what's called the Moral Foundations Dictionary, which is where they have taken the words. Remember when we did the five, we studied the big five in personality, and we had this whole list of words that fit under each of those five categories of personality. Well, they have done the same thing with the moral foundations, and we're going to look at those words because we're going to look and see where those words fall in our happiness attainment motivators, in our human happiness motivators, we will see that some of them are directly related. Some are indirectly related, and some are related to more than one, two, or three. So we'll look at those in greater detail later. But now we need to see how these moral foundations relate to what we know about the human happiness motivators and the appraisal process. We'll begin with a review of the human thinking process. But first I want to reintroduce some of the doctrine of regeneration to establish that we are different from unbelieving humans and therefore are not locked into morality, as well as establish the underpinnings of God's alternative to morality and how we can live above morality, which entails learning the difference. And we'll do that next hour. So please pray with me as we close this hour, and we'll take a 10-minute break, actually an 8-minute break, and we'll be back at 11 o'clock. So please try to hurry out and hurry back. Father, we are grateful for this hour of study. We're grateful to see the perspective of the human viewpoint and how moral foundations have been developed in their study and in their teaching, so that we can see how we relate to other people in our periphery, how we can relate to those around us who think differently than we do, so that we might understand them and be able to empathize with them and to be able to witness to them. We thank you for this hour. In Jesus' name,